What is your experience working on or with a legislative body and or legislative processes? Please be specific.
I am a paralegal, and so in that work, of course, I've had a lot of experience reading law, knowing law, reading legislation, and those kinds of things. So I have that experience, and I also spent quite a lengthy time in Oklahoma City and the Oklahoma City Capitol on legislative procedure, and had an enjoyable time there. And during that time, we did actually write legislation for the Oklahoma legislature. Some of our bills got passed, some of them went to the floor. So I had that experience there. And also, as I said, 5 years of watching and reading legislation with the Osage Nation, so I could understand what direction they're taking us, which is a direction that I'm not really comfortable with. You know, I believe I've really come into myself on experience and having the ability to see some of the problems that we need to correct as far as legislation goes. I just don't think that you can say too much on a piece of legislation, certainly not a bill to be enacted. Thank you.
Ms. Lazelle.
As many of you are aware, I worked for the legislative branch for 4.5 years. I worked 26 years for the state of Oklahoma. During the last part of that career, before I retired, I had an opportunity to go to the House of Representatives because I was involved in programs and services. And you actually get to see the process on the floor. You get to see your House representative participate in that. I was responsible in the Department of Corrections, Division of Programs and Services, to monitor the legislation as it affects programs and services. So I had some experience that I took with me when I went to work for Congress. I will say this, the first Congress and the second Congress were two separate entities. That first Congress, they set the foundation. They really did. They set the foundation on how they were going to do things, and they learned from that. The second Congress took full force and went with it. And I think the third Congress are going to be the people that is going to say, okay, we've got the foundation, we've got the process going, now let's involve the people. Let's involve them. Let's get them involved in the legislative process. So 4.5 years under some good leadership, under some good Congress members, have some that's very active. Very active. They are thriving on writing legislation. And then we had some that wanted to do oversight. So legislators is a variety of people. It's the farmer, it's people with legislative experience, it's people that, business people. So it's a variety of people that makes up the legislative branch. And I'm very thankful that I got the experience. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Branstetter.
I was elected to Congress 6 years ago, and so I began the new foundation of Congress. And at that time, we knew nothing. We started from scratch, and it was a difficult struggle at times, but we got through it and came to where we are. Since I've been on the second Congress, because I ran for 6 years, I've been the Speaker of Congress. I think I've demonstrated how to, when individuals introduce legislation, a lot of times with that first Congress, it would end up setting in committee. In the black hole is what we used to call it. And it was not setting in the black hole because it was poor legislation, but there were, I would say, personality conflicts. So with the second Osage Nation Congress, they have produced more legislation in the Thizo session and the Hunka session than they have in 5 years. I think that's because I demonstrated that when bills are placed in committee and they need to go to committee, committee meetings, demonstrated explanations of what the law is. That has happened. If I find committee chairmen who are not placing these on their agenda, I make a list. I tell them, this is what you had in committee. I go to the sponsor of the bill, notify them, this is your bill that's in committee. Ask your chairman to bring it forward. You know, if you have a problem, come to me, let me talk to them. Let's get this on the table. Sometimes these bills that are introduced, people don't like them, so they'll stay in committee, but at least they've been heard, and that's what I think needs to happen, that any legislation that any congressperson brings forward, if it doesn't go to committee and it's not explained, how is any legislator, person that's attending, you people may be there, how are you going to know what it is if you don't have an explanation at that time?
Ms. Shaw.
I have experience with the state of Oklahoma. I'm on one of the revenue boards, also on our finance committee, and we reviewed on board and in committees issues that needed to be addressed and maybe propose legislation. We would go meet with legislators, and we would go and discuss. Number one, they want to know where's the money coming from. So we would go and tell them where the money was coming from, if we were taking a cut in some other area, and that we felt like this was the best way to go forward for that particular agency. I've attended, so I'm familiar with the idea of how legislation works. Finding someone to sponsor your bill, getting a co-sponsor, hopefully, and talking to the members on that committee on a one-on-one, explaining your view and why you think it should be passed. And then sending it as a bill compared to the procedures that are provided. I also have attended meetings and committee meetings. Some of them were well, I don't want to say it, they were very well ran. Some of them were not. I believe that we need to stick to Robert's Rules of Order and not have cross-talking in session and also in committees. And I think the chairman of the committees and Ms. Branstetter does a very good job trying to keep them on task. So I think that's the way to get it done. And I also feel like we have to really look at our legislation and we're getting the appropriation for that legislation. They passed bills, there was no money to do the bill, so what good did it do to pass it? And that's done nationally, and I know that, like the law for No Child Left Behind, that was not funded, but it was passed and a big deal was made of it, but there was no money for it. So we have to be able to, as a group, look at our appropriations to see if we have enough money, talk to the Treasury, and then maybe come up with some suggestions regarding things we can save on the budget side.
Thank you. Mr. Hamilton.
With the boards and the committees I've sat on and chaired in my past experience, I learned how to hash out all the obstacles we face, and sometimes the discussions got pretty heated, and the stuff might fall on the floor. But we can come to agreement sometimes, and sometimes we don't come to an agreement and it stays stagnant. But I look forward to working together with the other people in Congress and to moving forward and bringing our nation.
Thank you. Does anyone want to use their 1-minute rebuttal time? Okay. Mrs. Branstetter, we'll start with you.
I would like to say that I've also attended Robert's Rules, and since the first Osage Nation Congress came in, we set up an orientation so that we have that after the election, so that all new members of Congress separate orientation so we can explain the process, what happens when the bill is introduced. They're afforded Robert's Rules of Training. The last election, we had a Robert's Rule of Training in our building so that those new Congress people could receive Robert's Rule of Training while they're working. And I think that that's a great orientation that we've had for the new Congress members so that they can know the whole aspect of what they're getting into before they go into their first session.
Ms. Miller, did you indicate?
I would just add that because we have this concern about legislation being hung up in committee, and sometimes with personal agendas, and sometimes because maybe there's a really tough piece of legislation. Perhaps maybe the Congress could put a time limit on this legislation. If the sponsor isn't able to come up with getting it to the floor, then I believe the committee as a whole should go over this legislation. And if they see that it's a personal agenda, it needs to be moved on. If it's not, then they need to allow. Because as I said before, a bad piece of legislation is more dangerous than no legislation at all. Heated debates, you know, if there's no heated debate, there's not enough thinking going into the legislation. If you have 12 people, they're all not going to agree. It needs to be looked at, and it needs to go through thoroughly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Ms. Lazelle.
I have a final comment that I'd like to state on the question of legislative experience in our government, the processes. One thing that I would like to see change is what they call fast tracking. Fast tracking is getting legislation through as quick as you can because you want to make sure it doesn't get vetoed. That's pushing it through. And there's not a whole lot of time to think about that. Suspending the rules. We're talking about Robert's rules. They suspend the rules an awful lot. I would like to see them go by the rule. And I also would like to see them not waive with the reading of the chief's veto. I'm an Osage person. He sends it over there to Congress. Congress has a transparency to communicate all of those back to the public. And I don't see why we wouldn't want to know why the chief and the executive branch would veto. Thank you.
Thank you.